Welcome to the Peace Catalyst podcast, where we share stories to inspire, uplift, and encourage you in your peacemaking journey. I'm Becca Tyvel, and I'm working with Peace Catalyst here in the Washington, D.C. area. And as always, I'm joined by my wonderful co-host, Allie Bernison.
Hi, everyone. I'm Allie, and I am with PCI in Los Angeles, California. So we always say it, but if you enjoy the Peace Catalyst podcast, please do us a favor and take some time to rate and review the podcast on Apple Podcasts. It helps boost our visibility and encourages others to give us a listen.
Thanks, everyone.
So this week, we had a wonderful conversation with PCI's very own Peter Anderson, who is based in Minneapolis, Minnesota, along with his wife, Liz. And together, they're equipping community peacemakers and collaborating with others for racial justice and healing, drawing on their experiences in community organizing and development, interfaith peacebuilding, and contemplative spirituality. They're weaving together internal and external liberation alongside their neighbors, fellow activists, and people of faith. Peter leads trainings in conflict transformation, nonviolence, trauma awareness, and healing, as well as community-based peace building. So we're super, super excited to get into the conversation. But before we do,
Can't wait to have this conversation with Peter. I've experienced just a couple of his workshops, and they are pretty incredible as a way to equip ourselves for some peacemaking skills. So really excited. And before we jump in, would love to share a quote with you all. This one is by a favorite of ours, really, John Paul Lederach. And it says, "We are called as individuals and congregations to learn the disciplines and skills that help us define ourselves, engage each other in non-anxious interaction, and maintain emotional contact even when we disagree." I love that phrasing, non-anxious interaction. That is, sounds like it's a hard place to get to, but
right.
Something that we can all strive towards. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Well, let's get into the conversation. Welcome, Peter. It's so great to have this conversation with you today. And I know we've had you on the podcast before with your wife, Liz, talking about your peacebuilding work there in Minneapolis. But really excited to have, more conversations and dialogue around peacebuilding formation and training. So could you just give us just a quick background, since we've probably already heard it. And if you haven't, you should definitely listen to that episode with Peter and Liz. But just a little bit of background on who you are and what you do with Peace Catalyst.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me back, Becca and Allie. So my name is Peter, and I have two roles with Peace Catalyst. So I am the Director of Formation, which basically means within Peace Catalyst, I get to put a lot of my time and energy towards thinking about both how staff in the organization and then how kind of our partners and our wider network and the churches we're working with outside of the organization. How do we form them as peace builders? And that involves with some of the spiritual formation, but also the very practical skills of like how do they look at their relationships and their communities, and have some tools to be able to make peace in those settings. And then I'm also a program director in Minneapolis, where a lot of my time is spent kind of working in areas of racial justice and racial healing. So I kind of do some community organizing about helping people get involved and work for change, and then also lead some racial healing circles where people come together and kind of process a lot of their own internal wounds and try to make sense of what's happening and what their place in racial justice is.
That's awesome.
Yeah,
we're so grateful for you and everything that you do for Peace Catalyst, and also those who are connected to us and eager to learn those skills for peace building. So
and I'm so excited to have this conversation because for me, I'm sure people who know me, like my mom, for instance, knows your name really well because I'm constantly saying, "Well, Peter says this." And yeah, when I
That's a
joined,
scary burden.
yeah, no pressure. Yeah, so when I joined on staff like a year ago, just through having conversations with you, I don't, well, to my knowledge, we weren't like working through a curriculum, but just within like an hour conversation every couple of weeks, I just learned so much about what it means to be involved in community peace building and where you even start. So yeah, I so then it leads me to this question, like where did you learn, like who did you learn from? Is there one, have there been particular experiences or um particular peace builders or theories, like what, where exactly do you draw, um yeah, where do you draw from, what has been influential, or what has been like particularly formative?
Mm. That I think is a very long list.
Hmm.
Um, that'll take up the rest of our time if we dive into that. Um, eh, Allie, you and I weren't necessarily working through a curriculum per se, but you were kind of my guinea pig for the curriculum that is being developed. So, like, what? So in a sense, like, there actually was an intention and direction for what you were talking about, and that feeds into what we're talking about today.
Sure,
Where, like,
okay.
as Peace Catalyst is thinking about, I'm using this term community peace builder, that I want people to kind of embrace this role. Um, and there is sort of a process of, um, yeah, working through that. Um, let's see, in terms of influences, so since college, I've spent my career working in churches or alongside churches. I was a pastor for a few years. I was a missionary for several years before coming to Peace Catalyst. In particular, I've long been aligned with the Mennonite tradition. So Mennonites, Anabaptists have a broad tradition of peace theology. It's kind of central to how we understand our faith in the world. Um, but then also alongside doing a lot of wanting to equip and mobilize churches to engage their communities and like actually make a difference where they are. I've always been in settings that's had a strong emphasis on place and the community around them, um, and what does it mean to be a community-based church. Um, and I think at the heart of that for me has always been wanting to mobilize lay people, the Christians in the pews, the regular congregation, to um, get a lot of the peace work and a lot of the pastoral work, even before I was talking about peace. Um, a lot of the missional work, something that was done by the whole congregation and not just the paid clergy or experts at the top. Um, and even as I was in a lot of those settings and often trying to help congregations get into a space that they could engage better, I kept coming across um, organizations and communities that spend a lot of time talking about the ideas. They have the right theology. They have community theology. They have peace theology. They have um, embodied theology and such. And it was always about how do we understand ourselves, or what am I supposed to believe that gets me from here to here. Um, but it was a lot harder to find groups or churches that were focusing on the nitty gritty of, so how do you do it well. Um, there were a lot of I've seen a lot of the Christian world focus very much on the heart that they put into it, focus on their intentions, what they aim for, what they want for, what they hope for. Um, but the discipleship does not include nearly as much. So how do we do it? How do we navigate relationships? How do we navigate our own emotional well-being so that we're understanding how we're engaging with the world around us? Um, even discipleship that moves to how do you do community organizing? How do you do kind of work for social change and like collaborate with partners? Um, and even in my own settings, like this was kind of a key turning point that really moved me into going and actually studying peace building and wanting to focus more on skills was being in a place where I've been doing this work for a long time and had been teaching explicitly about peace. And then when a major conflict hit my team over the course of like a year and a half, I myself didn't actually have the skills to know how to navigate that well. And even spending all of our time talking about it is still imploded in our context. And we ended up coming back to the U.S. because of it. Um, and that really stood out for me that there needed to be something a lot more substantial underneath
Mm.
that. So in terms of two influences, again, long list. Coming from the Mennonite tradition, there was a lot that I got from my seminary, the Anabaptist Mennonite Biblical Seminary in Elkhart, Indiana. There's also a lot of peace building resources, particularly around trauma, but also a lot of conflict transformation and other stuff coming out of Eastern Mennonite University, their Center for Justice and Peace building. One of the significant influences, both from my professor and then just kind of the whole tradition, is John Paul Lederach, and we talk about him frequently in Peace Catalyst. But yeah, several others. There there's also been a lot as I've gotten more connected with activists here on the ground, and particularly various streams of the Black liberation movement here in the U.S. and in Minneapolis. Um, Communities that are really trying to think about, so what does like healing justice look like? What does holistic peace look like? In particular, what does it look like to have peace where you can't rely on the authorities? You can't always want to call the police because that's not as healthy for the community. So really having to think about what do group dynamics look like? What does personal change look like? What does community care look like? And being able to look out for each other and support each other and have a much more robust idea of um, how a neighborhood cares for itself and how everybody in the neighborhood is supposed to be involved in that, because it can't be a outside top down sort of fix. So lots of influences.
Hmm. I'm curious, as you were sharing about being connected to churches and in terms of theory and belief systems and theology, it's, there's a healthy understanding of what it means to be firmly rooted in one's community, but then in terms of practice there's um yeah, we kind the churches you were connected to kind of missed the mark. And I think that's a fair critique of the church at large. I'm wondering, as you were seeing that reality play out, however you saw that playing out, was that painful? Was that difficult to see and come to terms with? Or yeah, was it like, yeah, I'm curious about that. Or
Mm. Um, I don't know that I experienced it as painful until my own lack of skill and my own team's lack of skill became apparent. Um, because before then, I think I was still very much in that sort of, like you need some skills. People talk about it. You learn from and network with other organizations doing it. So it's not like anyone's out there doing this without any sense of what they're doing. Like people understand that they feel kind of helpless if they don't know at least what a couple of first steps are. Um, but often having those few basic concepts or those first few steps can build enough confidence that then organizations or churches can think, okay, we have enough to get going. We don't really need to invest a lot more time. We don't need to invest a lot more resources in going deeper. Or if we do, the pastor needs to know it, or the paid organizer needs to know it, or the expert who's coming in from the outside. But that doesn't mean that peace building skills are part of our broader formation for the church. Um, so yeah, so I mean, for most of my career, I was in that camp where like we need to know enough, and I was winging it along with everybody else.
hmm.
Um, and it really took a lot of that personal conflict and personal crisis to recognize like, oh, I am really missing something here. And that kind of pushed me to start asking, so who is doing this well? Not who's talking about it well, but who's doing it well, and wanted to go learn from them.
Sure.
Mm. That's such a good point because I feel like, yeah, like peace building is like I don't know, would you say, Peter, that becoming a peace builder is adopting like a way of being and a way of life that like requires skills? Of course, you need to build skills to live that out, but in terms of like, yeah, like, does that make sense? Like, it's not just like something you pick up and do, but it's like a way
Mm.
of, yeah, becoming or something like that.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Um, yes, and maybe a parallel for this. It's not even a parallel; it's part of the conversation, um, that I've had frequently in past months, is looking at, say, like the nonviolence movement as a whole. Um, Nonviolence is a stream that has a lot of different branches, a lot of different streams of thinking in it. Some of those streams focus very much on that personal transformation, that nonviolent orientation, that embodied nonviolence. This is who I am and how I interact with the world. And then there are other streams of nonviolence that focus very much on the strategy, the specifics. Like, you don't have to be a pacifist, you don't have to be personally, ideologically committed to nonviolence, but you just need to understand that maybe this is the strategy or these are the techniques that work best to cause social change in this context. Um, and those two need to come together.
Mm-hmm.
If you're in a context where you're focused on nonviolence simply as a means of social change, this is how we engage in politics. This is how we try to overthrow this dictator using nonviolent means, as we've seen happen around the world. There's plenty of evidence that this works. Um,
Mm-hmm.
but if there isn't that heart underneath it, then it just gets replaced by more power struggles. And there's no guarantee that it's going to actually create a healthier society long term. And on the flip side, there are plenty of people who are ideologically committed to nonviolence. This is their spirituality. This is how they understand their faith. Or even if they're not people of faith, this is just how they understand who they want to be in the world. But if that is not paired with tangible skills and like what change are you actually trying to commit, or if you're not pairing that with who am I actually connected to and in solidarity with, it's easy to have a posture of nonviolence but then not actually be alongside people who are suffering and communities who are working for change, and it becomes more of a posture where you're almost pontificating a little bit rather than kind of saying this is how it's supposed to be, this is my observations on it. But the engagement actually can be a little bit more limited. So there's like two extremes. And healthy
Yeah.
nonviolence, just like healthy peace building as a whole,
Mm-hmm.
needs to be a mix of those two together. There's the personal transformation, but the personal transformation also needs to do something to impact the world around you.
Yeah. It's so good. Yeah. I feel like that's such a good, yeah, that makes a lot of sense because I also think sometimes I think in both realms, like the doing and the being, like peace building can seem kind of like esoteric or like, you know, people who maybe think like that doesn't, I don't really fit with that. Like, I don't think that way, or like, I can't be a peace builder because I prefer to address issues using some level of force, or I think that that's, like things like that, like, or even just this within the doing realm of like having the knowledge or having the skills of peace building is almost like, we're going to let these people do that. Like, but that's not for me. If that makes sense, how do we sort of like, yeah, bridge the gap and maybe, yeah, invite people in who are feeling that sort of
Mm.
exclusivity, even though that's not the intention
Mhm.
of, yeah, if that makes sense.
I think a lot of it is about the narrative that we're telling, and this is why I appreciate that Peace Catalyst is so involved in talking about theology and talking about how do we read Scripture and how do we understand our faith, the
Mhm.
narrative of why are we here and what are we moving towards, and the narrative of what is God doing in the world.
Right.
Um, this gets to the space where there needs to be a connection between what is the vision that we're moving towards, heaven, kingdom of God, shalom. Peace Catalyst uses shalom language quite a bit. Um, and how does that connect with, so what are we doing now? And in particular, and this is something that I think often gets missed a bit in the discipleship, is the idea of trajectory or movement. A lot of times theology is talked about, so here's the vision that we're kind of waiting for, God's going to come and do it, we just got to wait until this happens, or this is what we're dreaming of, this is what our faith is, what we're hoping for. And then there are these like tangible virtuous things of, so this is what we do now, we feed the poor, and we help people when they need it, and we're kind to each other, and we love each other. But it's so often just about, this is how you're supposed to behave and how you're
Mm,
supposed to care for each other, and it never gets into the why.
mm,
It never gets into, so what are we actually trying to change in ourselves to do this? What are we trying to change in our relationships, in our church community, so that we look a lot more like the kingdom of God that we're dreaming of, so that we look a lot more like the shalom that God is calling us towards, that God is creating in the world. Um, and then that scales up to the community level. Like, it's great to go and help people who don't have housing, who need food, um, who need financial assistance. But if just helping people who are in dire need is where it ends, and there's not this trajectory of, okay, so how do we engage in other parts of society to um, how do we move upstream and stop people from being thrown into the river? I can't remember whose quote that is. Is that Desmond Tutu? Yes.
mm.
I can't remember.
I like that.
I should look that up. But
I don't know.
I
yeah,
know.
how do
Yeah.
how do we stop just pulling people out of the river when we see they're in
Right.
trouble, and move
Yeah.
upstream to figure out why they're being thrown in the first place and put an end to that?
Yeah.
Right.
And that step of moving upriver and looking at the bigger picture, and the skills of how do you root out the violence and root out the trauma and heal the trauma and root out the underlying causes of our personal violence, of the violence we experience in our churches, or the conflict we experiences, and tons of social violence we experience.
Hmm.
Um, that's the
Yeah.
trajectory of discipleship, of moving towards shalom, that this points to. And we can't do that well without adding the skills in also.
Right.
In my experience, that what you were just describing of moving further upstream and examining institutions, systems, like when you start to break apart, when you start to do that work, that's when it gets scary, at least. And I'm speaking from my own experience. That's when it gets scary to some people of faith, to some Christians, to the church. But again, not, yeah, this is just in the way I've seen, or what how I've seen the church interact with mission or with community engagement, however you want to put it. But it's so much easier to do the individual one-to-one feeding ministries, or like, why is that? Why when we're talking about taking on a system does it get like, okay, whoa, like this is too progressive, it's like labeled something else, and it like doesn't belong in the church, it belongs in the political realm, and it's not.
Mm,
um is it because our culture, it does it have something to do with how, like, the interplay of um yeah, how community work, or community engagement interacts with our individualistic culture, and just how we see I don't know. Yeah.
mm. I think there's a lot of different layers to that. Um,
Sure.
and part of it, I think, is this big political dimension that you mentioned, particularly here in the U.S. Um, where if you're doing anything that seems like it's going to get lumped in with social justice, then it gets labeled with things like critical race theory or
Mhm.
Marxism or wokeism, and segments of the church is like, well, no, those are trigger words, so we're just going to not deal with it. That's not what the church is here for. And those congregations have particular political narratives and particular theological narratives that just have a very limited view of what they're supposed to be doing and what they're engaging in. I think a lot of it though is about it's still about the discipleship and the narratives that the churches tell, and that um, and where they put their energy a little bit. So like one of the key dimensions of this, and this gets back a bit to what Becca was asking about kind of accessibility and something that like makes it easy for people to enter into. I want to teach, I want Peace Catalyst, I want everyone to teach and learn a whole wide range of peace building skills. But people have limited time, limited attention, limited capacity. If someone has the time or energy to really full time devote themselves or half time devote themselves to being a peace builder and wants to go hard into this as like a professional thing, please come talk to us because we want to talk to you in Peace Catalyst. Um, but that's not all that we want to work with. So there is also this question of collective capacity, where it's not just one person learns all the skills and then there's icon of peace building in their community, but it's how do you do this as a small group? How do you do this as a church? Where it needs to become both where churches are putting their resources and in the stories the churches are telling. People don't have the imagination for this because they're not in communities that are telling stories about it. They're not developing the moral imagination, to use a phrase from John Paul Lederach, of the change that could happen and what could be in the world that they're creating. And so often, like, resources are put towards just that, like, immediate aid. We're going to go help with this food kitchen. We're going to donate to this cause, this urgent thing that happened. And if churches are able to start telling more stories about, so here's what could be happening, here's how we align with groups who are trying to create deeper, longer lasting change. And then if they start to think, how do we resource the congregation?
Mhm.
So maybe we have a team over here who actually knows a lot about social change and activism, and they actually have some key partnerships in the community who are helping to move that along. And they have the expertise. That doesn't mean the whole congregation needs the expertise in it. And then you might
Mhm.
have this group over here who's like, oh, they are all about showing up for people who are on the streets or who need food right now, and they have some training to both do that relief aid well and also deal with some of the trauma and the counseling that goes along with it, so they can be a present at the moment. The churches take a collective capacity approach, then you can still have a whole congregation that views this sort of practical skill, this practical trajectory of change as part of their embodied discipleship, as part of their practical work of who they are in their world, in their community, um, without having to make it each person's responsibility to know everything, because that
Mm.
becomes really overwhelming.
Right. Right. Yeah, you're kind of painting a vision of beloved community right there in a way.
Yep, there's a lot to that.
Yeah.
Yeah, as I said, so like a lot of where I'm coming from here, one of my big streams has been connecting with marginalized communities and learning from marginalized communities who have had to figure out how to care for themselves and care for each other without a whole lot of outside support.
Right.
So both in Christian settings and in non-Christian settings, there's a lot of examples of people who have had to figure out how to do this well. So there's plenty to learn from.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I love what you're saying about having that learning. Yeah, like having peace building be part of the structure of a community, like not just having individuals, but having it being part of the main message that people are getting, because it's, yeah, like if they're not hearing it from um, the pulpit, then I think it, like you said, it's hard to imagine, or to even just have that be part of your consciousness
Hmm.
as you're,
Yep.
yeah,
And yeah, and I'm very excited that Peace Catalyst has been working a lot on that over the past couple of years. Like that is a big part of what the Christian Peace Building Network that we've helped develop wants to point people towards. People who go
right,
through the CPN learning cohorts where they embrace both the theology, but then also the practicalities of conflict transformation and kind of how those fit together. Like that, those are designed to help Christians and faith
Right.
communities understand how these fit together. So I think there's been a lot of work in that area already.
Mhm.
yeah, absolutely. And Peter, you're talking about like skills that are needed um, for growing in peace building. What are some of those skills, would you say?
Mm.
And how do you learn them?
So one of the things that there's like several pieces that can go with this. Um, PCI's community peace building process itself, like just a very simple template for how we want people to engage with their communities. We go through the understand, the connect, the collaborate model. Um, and there are particular skills for when you understand, when you're on the understanding. How do you map your network? How do you walk around your network and just develop a sensitivity to what's going on there? How do you research? How do you ask questions? How do you meet people? How do you pay attention to what's going on inside of you so
Mm.
you can figure out what your triggers are, what your sensitivities are, what skills or roles you might bring to the table so that when you're entering a community or when you're starting this work, you're like, I kind of have a sense of myself. I know who I am. There are skills and tools that can go in to that understanding. And then when you move to connecting, there are specific skills like from community organizing about how do you actually do a one-on-one? How do you sit down with a person and build your network and get a sense of who they are and what they care about and um, whether they might be a potential partner in the future. There are skills for how do you show up in a new place and kind of identify, oh, here are some key people I see who are organizing this event that I might want to talk to, or just
Mhm.
kind of get a sense of this is the undertone that I want to pay attention to in this community, or here are the narratives and the stories that people are telling, and that'll influence what's going on. Um, there are skills and tools for how do you bring people together. How do you help people to build relationships? How do you help people to hear each other? How do you have healthy dialogue? How do you organize a peace feast? How do you even develop the intercultural skills, across cultural skills to talk to someone who does not look like you, comes from a different faith or background than you, um, and both build trust and build a relationship, and then get to the point that they want to collaborate with you and start doing things. Um, and then when we move to the collaborate, I really want to paint a broad picture of what community peace building could look like because it involves doing community aid where you're responding to immediate needs. Oh, there's violence. Let's show up. Oh, there's unhoused people. Let's show up and figure out how we support them. This like immediate dire need where people need some help or relief. There is community building. We're like, okay, there's a lot of siloed communities in our neighborhood. There's a lot of communities that don't talk to each other, or maybe there's some conflict in the midst of them. How do we do community building where we bring people together and just build these relationships?
Mhm.
Because without networks of relationships, nothing else can grow out of that. Communities need ties within it to support it. Um, and there's a whole lot that goes into community development where you're looking at your neighborhood. And this is all collaborative work, different dimensions of collaborative work. And it's the lens of like, what do you look at in your neighborhood to say, with your partners, what do we need right now? Where do we need to put our energy and our resources? Where do I want to show up? So community development goes from hosting the community garden to um, teaching English as a second language, all the way to let's have a organize an apartment building and we'll buy it specifically for low income residents or affordable housing. So from like very small scale stuff to like entire neighborhood transforming dimensions. Um, and then there's this piece of community activism. So if there's something harmful in the community or if there's an outside force such as a corporation or such as um, a political leader who's either directly harming the community or just being negligent and not giving your neighborhood the care that it needs. How do you organize your neighbors to work together and build power to actually create the change that someone on the outside needs to be doing something different to make happen? So,
Mm.
um, yeah, and that, I mean, that can
Mhm.
range anywhere from bigger topics like voting rights and accessibility and who's allowed to go to these places to dealing with more resources to confront food deserts, even as small as this intersection really needs a stop sign because people are getting hurt here and it's dangerous and we need the city to come and do something about it, and pressuring them
Mm.
for that. Even that is a form of community activism.
Yeah, I think in the context of thinking of, yeah, all kind of the holistic approach to peace building and looking at all these different things, like you're saying, affecting the community and understanding your own role in that place. Like, what is my role as a, you know, a white woman in a place where I'm trying to collaborate with those seeking
Hmm.
racial healing and justice? Like,
Hmm.
and how, yeah, I think that's, and that could be a harder question
Hmm.
actually, is,
It's
yeah.
it's a hard question, but it's an essential one, and it's one that if we don't start with that, then it all becomes so overwhelming that it's really scary to get into it because we don't know where
Mhm.
to start. We don't know who to talk to. If we don't start with the question of, so who is my community? Like, I can look at all of Minneapolis or I can look at all of the problems in the US. But if I don't start with what community am I part of? Who am I in relationship with? Because this work starts best through the relationships we already have. If I'm if I'm approaching this as I'm on the outside, I'm not part of this. I'm just an outsider looking in and then I want to come in and fix it. That's both harmful to the work and actually makes it hard for myself because I have this big, supposedly but not really objective view. Um,
Hmm.
and I have this like outside savior mentality. But if I can say, hey, I am part of this community, I am in relationship with these people, I'm affected by this too. I'm working for my own healing, I'm working for my own liberation, I'm working for my own peace, along with the peace of
Hmm.
my neighbors.
Mhm.
Um, and then I really have to sit with who I am here and what do I bring to this. Then it helps add a lot more clarity of just where to start. So, and I mean, that's always the first question you want to get to is where do you start? What are the first couple of
Where do you
steps?
start?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's so good.
I I don't really know how to ask this question, but I think the question, hopefully we'll find it along the way, is um so earlier in the conversation we were talking about the end, or the end vision, what we're aiming towards, which can be
Hmm.
expressed differently.
Hmm.
Shalom,
Yep.
kingdom. I mean,
Yep.
yeah.
Or,
Um,
or tell
is
us.
it
Yeah.
sure? Yeah.
To use theological language. Yeah.
Wink, wink.
Yeah. Is it so? I know that we can do this work in partnership with others, and that's the goal. Hopefully, you're doing it in partnership with a diverse community, a community, with diverse skill sets, and um, coming from different backgrounds, and that this is inclusive work incorporating an entire community. But um, with, I guess the question is, there needs to be a common end in sight, correct? Like we can't be doing community development, community aid, any of this work unless we're agreeing on where we're trying to get. Is that, and I mean, I don't know how broad or specific that view needs to be, whether it's just broadly we're aiming towards shalom, or we're trying to get this thing passed through city council, or
I think so. Yes.
okay.
And I think the answer to that is yes and no. Like, there needs to be some sort of coalescing a vision where people are working towards the same sort of goal. But often that is more about values than it always is about the specifics.
Mm-hmm.
You can align with people who are like, I want a healthy, flourishing community. You can work with people who are like, I want everybody to have a voice and to be supported here and to be included here. Um, you can work with people who are like, I want marginalized and oppressed groups to experience liberation and come out from underneath these social forces that are holding them down. You can work with um, groups who want to see democracy flourish and want to um, see power shared and everybody have a voice in what their community and what their nation looks like. At the same time, different groups might have different visions of how do you get there, or what does that look like, or how do we respond to the forces that are opposing us right now. Um, and so, particularly from a community organizing perspective, like a lot of organizing is about holding on to your vision of what you're working towards, and then finding the people who are ready to go with you on that next step. You might have someone who's a partner for the next couple of projects, and then you find that you diverge ways. At the same time, you might find someone who maybe you share a similar sort of ideal or vision with them, but you're working on very different projects. And maybe it's 5 years down the line, like, oh, now I see that we're actually coming together and can support each other a little bit.
Hmm.
Um, so it's really hard to work with someone who has a very different value, a very different set of values or expectations of what healthy community looks like, or what power should look like and who should hold it. Um, there's some clear divergences that make it hard to work for the shalom that the Bible tells us about. Um, but in terms of actual partnering, that's the thing that kind of comes and goes all the time.
How is what you're talking about there different or, yeah, similar to? I know that in our conversations in the past, we've talked about this, how um, in my early days with Peace Catalyst, when I had a vision of organizing some sort of program or, um, yeah, it really didn't have legs yet, but something with Muslim and Christian youth, yeah, that's kind of my vision. And then once I started following the steps that you gave me, it's like, okay, that's actually maybe not what the highest need is in the community, or just what people are invested in already. Anyway, um, but as I was having conversations in my early days, I got a lot of feedback from people in my church, or just that I was connected with through other places within the community. People saying, "Oh, well, I mean, I get it, but that's just not my thing. It's like not really the thing I care about. My thing is this." And I mean, there are so many ways we can be peace builders in our communities.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I don't know. So I definitely hear what you're saying, and not everybody's going to be a partner all the time,
Mm.
because people are invested in different issues in the community. But that the way that you're framing it strikes me different from the framing of it. Like, that's not my, I do this thing, and like, you can care for refugees. I do this, which that always just feels weird to me. Especially coming from
Mm-hmm.
a faith perspective.
Mhm.
Yep.
Yeah.
When, yeah, this is one of the reasons why I think doing this in the context of a faith community or just community in general, like in Peace Catalyst, we're talking about churches and faith communities specifically, but this same dynamic plays out whether you're a religious community or a secular one. Um, there is so much life and so much support that comes from doing this in the context of a community that is telling stories about this and encouraging this movement and is holding on to this vision of what are we moving towards. That's still where the theology and the narrative comes in. There still needs to be this picture of this is how we are trying to partner with God in the world. This is how we are participating with God to bring about God's shalom, while recognizing different people in the church will have different passions, vocations, and skills that will take them different places and bring them to different networks. And as long as the church is a space that encourages them to come back and share what they're doing and share what they're learning and share the benefits of their relationships and to continue to invite each other into that work,
Hmm.
then churches can be a place where this can flourish and still hold on to the diversity at the same time. Now, churches will usually decide to put money and energy as an organization, as a church, into some specific areas. We'll say, well, here's a budget to work on advocacy for the unhoused. Here's a budget that's going to go into reparations or giving land back, and working on justice that way. So churches are still going to have some priorities that, like, as a congregation, they decide, oh, this is where we want to put our institutional money. Um, but as long as the church and the congregation are still holding on to this vision of all of this weaves together, all of this is part of the process of challenging and confronting sin in the world. Because
Mm,
so many of our problems come from the same sort of inequity in the
yeah.
world, and the same sort of oppressive power in the world, and the same sort of stories and narratives that we use to demonize each other. So many of the problems that we are confronting and challenging as peace builders stem back to some of the same influences and some of the same wounds, some of the same trauma that individuals and cultures experience.
Right.
Um, so yeah, a lot of it is the role of the church in the body
Hmm.
to understand how all of that intersects and to be able to celebrate all of the work, even if a particular person doesn't feel called or doesn't have the capacity.
Hmm.
Capacity is a huge thing here. It doesn't have the capacity to show up for what everyone else is doing.
Right. Right.
I love how you're saying that, Peter, because it's like, yeah, like holistically celebrating all these different
Hmm.
ways that people are contributing to shalom or um, living into their passions and their skills and where they feel called. And I think, yeah, I feel like from like my perspective, it's like, can we share the understanding part of like, I may not be working directly on this issue, but I understand how it's connected to
Hmm.
these other realms of conflict and um, inequity and the needs for healing. So
Hmm.
yeah.
Yep.
Hmm.
Yep.
Yeah. And I mean, that's definitely, I have observed that a lot of the things that we're struggling with in community are very interrelated. You can't look at economic inequality without looking at how it's affecting education and public schools and homelessness and unaffordable housing and like all of these things. You can't isolate one without kind of touching another. So, and then of course there's a
Hmm.
huge racial justice component to most of that.
Hmm.
And so yeah. So I think being able to see that as people of faith, and then also being able to honor and respect and uplift where others are working. Yeah, I really like the way that you put that. So
Mm.
Yeah, and Peter, like as you're like growing others through kind of this formation work and skills training, like have you found um yeah, can you share maybe a story of like the impact of those workshops or trainings that you've kind of helped guide people through?
Mm. The Give some pieces to that. I think one of them, Ali already mentioned earlier, like one of her key impacts. So like the community peace building kind of process or formation process that I was guiding her through. Um, she was saying that really helped her, like both totally understand differently what her place in the community was going to be and what she wanted to focus on. And I
it
think it had
definitely
a
did.
yeah, and my perception is it also helped her get to the connections and relationships in her place in the community now, and help her
Hmm.
kind of identify some of that. So even that tangible of it, I'm going to take as evidence of this being useful.
Yeah,
Um,
definitely.
but so one of the courses that we're running right now, so there's a whole host of kind of courses and trainings that we're developing over these next several months. At the
Hmm.
moment, we're just wrapping up a nonviolent communication course, um, which it's based off of the a curriculum called NVC for All from an expert NVC trainer, Roxy Manning, and I'm doing it in partnership with a local partner here in the Twin Cities, Pan Winthrop Lauer, who also is a certified NVC trainer. Um, and nonviolent communication it's both like a process, but also a worldview for how do you understand and work with communication language in a way that connects you to other people. So how do you move beyond judgments? How do you move beyond blame? And how do you embrace your emotions and understand the emotions of others and work with those in a way that connects and builds bridges? And one of the key points of NVC is really learning to identify what are the kind of the core emotional needs that are underneath our feelings and our
Mm,
judgments, and to say like
mhm,
what need inside of me. I need to feel safe. I need to feel like I need some agency or power in my world. um,
mhm,
I need connection to other people, or I need a sense of identity and purpose. So all of these underlying needs, and then everything we do is an attempt to meet those needs, even if it's not always intentional or explicit. Everything we do is an attempt to meet some sort of internal need. So
mm,
so over the course of the NVC class, as we've gone through the different components and the different ways of how do we understand what's happening inside of us, how do we understand what's underneath what people are saying, um, we're just having a lot
mhm,
of really good stories where people in the class are noticing new dimensions to their relationships. They're problem solving differently. They're like, oh, I was in conflict with a coworker, um, and I was able to slow down and check in with myself and notice what I was feeling.
mm,
Or I was dealing with this conflict where, instead of judging or yelling back at them, I was able to hear what need they had underneath what they were saying, and we were able to find something that worked for both of us.
mm.
um, or even just like more patience with kids. I mean, this has been a huge thing for me as a parent practicing nonviolent communication. I understand my kid. I understand why my kids flip out so often. It's because they have these needs underneath that I am not helping them meet at the moment.
Mm,
um, so yeah, NVC is very useful for both kind of your internal self-awareness and having compassion for yourself, but also has a lot for your relationships with others, and also just understanding how to interact with social systems and how those impact people and how those do or don't meet people's needs. Um,
mhm.
so
That's
that's the current
great.
one going on. And then other courses in the future. I mean, there'll be the next one coming up. Um, hopefully in June. We're working out the details for it. Will be a 6-week course, um, about interpersonal conflict skills. So it'll include a little bit of the basics of NVC. We'll spend time talking about kind of 4 lenses that I think are crucial to understand conflict and violence. So kind of
Mm,
the lens of narrative, the lens of needs, the lens of trauma and wounds, and also the lens of power. How do you understand the power dynamics of what's happening in space? And then get into the practical things like, so how do you have compassion for yourself and empathy for others? When someone's really worked up, how can you de-escalate them
mm.
or connect with them so that they feel heard and they're able to come down and talk about things a little bit? And like that is something that's very useful in your family and your work relationships. That's also something we practice and work on, like when we're providing security or when we're providing safety for street protests.
Mm,
So these
mhm.
skills apply in a lot of different areas. Um, yeah, there'll be some other bits in there too. We'll probably do a primer on some circle process and like how to just like have healthy conversations as a group where everybody can hear each other, some other stuff like that. Um,
Yeah.
and then later on, we'll also have courses about kind of nonviolence generally, which will have both the practical side of it and, kind of the internal visionary side of it. We'll do courses on kind of how do you understand social change and social movements and how do you get engaged in those, um, and then a few others. And there's also just a lot of expertise in peace catalysts otherwise. So I'm kind of excited in the future to see more staff offer courses as well. So
Yeah. That's so great. Yeah, I think a lot of those skills that you're talking about, I think we don't often know where to go to be equipped in that way
hmm
for building peace,
hmm
and handling conflict in our own lives. Because I think, yeah, peace building, I think, is often more like, how do I help other people build peace with each other
hmm
instead of like, how do I manage my
yep,
own
Hmm.
conflict within
Yeah.
myself, conflict with
Hmm.
people in my life, and
As peace builders,
yeah,
we know it's all interconnected.
right,
I have to be doing the work with myself and in my direct relationships and in society as a whole because they all influence each other.
right,
Whether
yeah,
whether or not I'm doing peace building and healing in myself impacts how I interact with others and how I show up in my community. The forces that are happening in the society beyond what I can see, the social structures, the power dynamics influence what's happening with me and my friends and inside of me. Um,
and that's I
yeah.
personally, I mean, that's something that I would love to learn more about, like from your class, because I don't think a lot of um, yeah, like peace building people talk about those connections,
Mm,
or like it's hard to discover a framework for that. So yeah, I'd be
mm,
excited to learn more about that
mm. Yeah,
in your
two
class.
two things I'm excited about focusing on in kind of this whole project of developing more courses. So like this is an initiative Peace Catalyst is doing, is trying to ramp up our ability to train and equip peace
Yeah,
builders in the church.
great.
Um, and which we're currently having a fundraiser on, which we're trying to raise several $1,000s, $12,000 over the next 6 months or so to be able to kind of
Yep.
support our ability to do that well and show up for churches and help with that. But the two pieces I'm really excited to be working on. One of them is this dimension of the intersection of both understanding the intersection of the personal work, the relational work, and the social work. And then you can also get into
Mhm.
the spiritual work and kind of the ecological work and like the whole system.
Mhm.
But then there's also this dimension of understanding kind of change and peace building and transformation as an ecosystem, where it's not just,
Mhm.
well, I feed poor people, that's my thing, and I don't have to
Mhm.
pay for the rest. But having this dimension where you understand how the activism and the development and the aid and the relationship building, everything else all fit together
Mhm.
to move toward this bigger change. And I'm also just
Mhm.
excited to find ways to translate these skills that are so often used in professional settings with professional peace
Mhm.
builders, um, and just make make them really accessible.
Yeah.
Like my heart is always about how are we equipping lay folk? How are we equipping congregations? I absolutely want pastors and professionals to come to the things that we teach too. Um,
Mhm.
but my heart, and think a lot of Peace Catalyst's heart, is how do we
Yeah.
translate these skills so everybody is better equipped as a peace builder, as a peacemaker in their community, without needing
Definitely.
a master's in peace studies to do it.
Yeah, exactly. Amen to that. And I'm so excited for everything that you're developing. And yeah, if you're listening, if you would like to contribute to that project, we will have the link in the episode description. So keep an eye out for that, because maybe that's something that you could benefit from yourselves too, if you're listening to this. So, and I remember, Peter, last year you co facilitated a workshop called, it was about the from blame to mourning process.
Mm, mhm,
Um, and I just
mm,
remember that was so, yeah, that impacted me so much on a personal level. And it also, yeah, I was able to invite a few friends from my church community, and they were also deeply impacted by that. So those kinds of practical like skills and processes, I think, yeah, we all need them. So
mm.
it's really
Yeah,
great to hear how you,
that
yeah.
was. I particularly want to give credit. So that particular process from blame to mourning is a nonviolent communication, kind of self-reflection and healing process. That in particular one was um, created or at least adapted by my partner, my MDC partner, Pan Winthrop Lauer. So I can't take credit for it.
Okay,
I can take credit for creating the space, but that was her process that she
sure.
brought. So,
Yeah, no,
so
that's great.
which is why I
Yeah,
love, because we're also in relationship with a whole lot of awesome people with great skills. So it's not only what can we teach, but it's also who else can we bring in to share skills, because we don't need to hoard them or protect them, because these are for everybody.
yeah, exactly. That's great. Well, is there anything else, Peter, that you would like to share or give us to think about as we
Mm,
close out our time?
I don't think so. Help us make this happen and pay attention, because there will be a lot of upcoming events and opportunities to join in.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much for your time, Peter.
Thank you.
Wow, that was really great. I love hearing from Peter's, yeah, just his like background and experience that he has with, I think in particular, like community peace building, and
Mhm.
he really has that holistic perspective on what it looks like to engage as a peace builder in your community. And I just really, yeah, respect and appreciate everything that he shared.
Yeah, me too. It's fascinating to hear more, just when you're able to have longer conversations about how people get to where they are in their thinking and practice. And so I really appreciated in our conversation as we were talking about his own journey in the church and working with the church and for a church, and um yeah, being overseas for a portion of time, and kind of all of those experiences, um ultimately leading him to where he is now, and just this healthy level of critique, seeing what was lacking in his own team and in his own church community. And I think that there is something just very admirable and healthy about that. Just being able to reflect on experiences and where things are not maybe where they should, where they could be, where they should be, but not running away necessarily from the church, but then kind of going deeper, a deeper level of theology and practice of faith. Whereas I think many times when we notice, like, okay, this is maybe who we're called to be, or who we say we are, and we're not being these people, then it's so easy to like disengage and say, well, then I don't want to be like attached to that for sure. But
Mhm.
it's much bolder and courageous to kind of go deeper, which is what
Mhm.
I see him doing, I think. And I don't know if you would agree with that, but yeah.
Mhm. Yeah, that's so well put. I think the temptation to just kind of leave it all behind is really strong because, yeah, if you're used to kind of, uh, yeah, being associated with that, and then you think like, well, the only answer is to disassociate myself and to disengage. But yeah, I agree with how you said that that journey of going deeper and growing in our theological understandings of shalom and peace building and yeah, not giving up on the journey. I think it's the temptation is probably very, very real. But what does it look like to actually engage our theology in a healthy way that helps us to grow? I think
Right.
that's really good. And I think that this sort of growing in our kind of becoming of peace building, but also in the skills like we're talking about is,
Mhm.
I loved how Peter phrased it of they go hand in hand and kind of this integrated approach that really helps us to grow into, yeah, who God is calling us to be um, in our communities. So yeah, I'm excited for the classes that are being developed by Peter and others that he's collaborating with, and that we'll be able to kind of expand our own equipping abilities as an organization because of this project that Peter is working on. So
Right.
I'm, yeah, really excited to see that grow and become what it's going to be. So.
Yeah, me too. I mean, yeah, I really appreciate, in all of my conversations with Peter, and I shared a bit about this on the podcast, but he really has been instrumental in me getting involved in my community. And I shared a bit of my journey, kind of where I started with wanting to be somewhere in the realm of Muslim Christian peace building, and maybe designing programming, or being, yeah, coming up with some sort of program for youth specifically, and then ending up more in the realm of housing justice, and looking at the socioeconomic divide in my community. all of that was through just having conversations with Peter. And yeah, like he said, I guess I was the guinea pig, didn't know. But I just appreciate the way that it's not just understanding. It's not just attending a workshop to like gain more knowledge or just amass more understanding, but it actually takes you somewhere. It's like taking you on a journey to get involved in the community. It's not an isolated process, or not an isolated I don't know, like a lifestyle. It's not an isolated way of being. Like peace building is intrinsically collaborative, and it requires an entire community, and it is not just about knowledge. And so I do appreciate that about his training, is there is like this second crucial piece of practice. So yeah, can't plug it enough.
So great. That's awesome. Yeah, and it's exciting to think like how many more people can go along a similar journey of learning how to engage in their own communities. So yeah, and if you're listening to this episode and that sounds like something that you'd want to engage with, or even if you care about this and you want to help make it happen, definitely consider making a gift to contribute to that project, because it's already having an impact on people like us and like you, Allie. You're unbeknownst to you as a guinea pig, but still that the impact that it's had, that we can actually have an even greater impact in the future. So definitely check it out. And if you feel like giving to that project, please do that. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, rate, and review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and wherever you listen to podcasts. And for more info about Peace Catalyst and to help support our peace building work, please visit our website at peacecatalyst.org.